As various protests and social movements continue to ensnare our socio-political world here, many people are left asking the question, why? And it's no secret that many of the people who happen to be participating in many of these protests, especially many of the left-leaning protests, happen to be young people, people in Gen Z, or maybe even a little bit younger than Gen Z. And then this has caused a lot of people to draw up a lot of explanations as to why they are participating in these protests, whether it be in the infamous 2017 free speech riots that happened at Berkeley, where Antifa mobilized to stop speakers like Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter and others from speaking peacefully on college campuses, whether it be in the so-called, now dubbed colloquially, the Summer of Love in 2020 following the death of George Floyd, where several cities burned to death, and there was also Chaz Chop, the autonomous zone established in Seattle, whether it be the more recent protests happening with Palestine. The theme is clear. It's predominantly young people leading the charge. So there are two explanations that people have drawn up, both of which, by the way, that I firmly reject, and I'll actually explain why. The first explanation as to why there are so many young leftists participating in these protests is that these leftists, young leftists, are ballasts. And what that means is that they are simply uninformed, useful idiots, useful fools, rather, who can be manipulated by propagandists and weaponized for the ends of those propagandists. If we're going to be charitable in assessing any position, we must establish an advocate for that position. So, the Venerable Thomas Saul had a quote that is recently being shared by people in defense of this position. And that quote says the following, I quote, "Activism is a way for useless people to feel important, even if the consequences of their activism are counterproductive for those they claim to be helping and damaging to the fabric of society as a whole." So this viewpoint says that these young leftists are just doing this because they feel useless, because they are young and impressionable, and they have absolutely nothing to add to society except to be a tool in the hands of some shadowy propagandist. Now, while I think there is some merit to this viewpoint, because if you look at any of the revolutions, especially the cultural revolutions of the past 60, 70, 80 years, or even before that, they're predominantly driven by young people. Some of the great dictators of the world, like Adolf Hitler and Mao Zedong, they both deployed young people, Hitler with the Hitler Youth and Mao Zedong with his sort of young revolutionary guard, to push forward their agenda. In youth, there is a kind of innocence and also a kind of ignorance that leaves the malleable mind susceptible to the machinations of those who are much older and who are much more experienced. Having said that, the reason I reject this viewpoint is for a few reasons. Number one, it is not charitable to assume your enemy is dumb and useless when your enemy, in this sense, has actually achieved more than you have. Think of how much the young left has achieved on a cultural level versus the young right, or versus the right wing in general. Think about how much. Think about how the sort of Black Lives Matter movements literally shifted the discourse around race in America towards a more limited, a more narrow, and I would dare say a less enlightened status. Think about how, for example, a lot of the sort of gender ideology and gender identity movements that have been happening have also shifted the discourse in institutions in America and in the West on how they deal with those issues. Think about how cancel culture, which was a major thing that followed the Me Too movement. Think about how cancel culture in all aspects of society, whether it be with Me Too, whether it be with gaming, whether it be in just people having different views. Think about how much that, which is predominantly driven by young leftists, have managed to shift the realm of acceptability in the Overton window in what can be talked about and what cannot be talked about. Think about how all these movements, some conceived with good intentions, like Me Too. Me Too was about sexual assault survivors speaking up, which is good intentions, but then people took advantage of that to use it for bad ends. Think about how all of that has changed the discourse. I would challenge all of you, tell me a single major right-wing movement in the West that has changed the discourse around a particular topic as profoundly as these several left-wing movements have. Maybe you could say the farmers' protest in Europe, I would say. Although I would classify more so as simply a defense of private property against the machinations of a kind of internationalist green tyranny that seeks to cram environmentalist regulations down the throats of average people to further some broader agenda, which ultimately has nothing to do with the environment and everything to do with this creation of this egalitarian abstract world that will ultimately harm all of us in reality. Maybe you could take the truckers' movements. But the truckers' movements during the COVID-19 protest, unfortunately, while they were powerful and I supported them, they have not yet shifted the discourse around how people see medical institutions and their connections with power and their legitimacy. The truth is this: if your enemy is so useless, as this quote from Saul says, or how other people will say, then how in the world is your enemy beating you? They're beating you because they are resonating with people. They are resonating with people who are on the same level as them. And unfortunately, that's the true subject. We have to get people off a level of mediocre thinking and get them towards a more enlightened state. We'll address that in a second. But also, my second objection to this point is that everyone of all ages is susceptible to propaganda. An entire generation of Americans, the silent generation, were convinced that if they decided to keep their private property to themselves, and if they decided to embrace that kind of Americana of independence, they were somehow supporting Hitler during World War II. An entire generation of people were convinced about that. And that left a mark. And to this day, instead of seeing the FDR sort of World War II era as a reviling default from the spirit of Americanism and ultimately a blotch on our national consciousness, many people see it as a sign of American strength, standing up to evil. The fact that many adults believe that is a testament to the power of propaganda. So don't give me this nonsense about how young people are just so dumb and useless when you have grown adults and grown men and women believing myths that were spoon-fed to them from cradle to, unfortunately, many of them, their grave. The second explanation as to why these youth activists are doing this is perhaps more interesting, and that is that these people lack meaning and purpose. You may have heard Vivek Ramaswamy say during the campaign season that the source of all of this is a fundamental lack of purpose and meaning. Dennis Prager had a segment where he himself said that protests give people who have no meaning, meaning. And while I think this seems to be plausible if you don't look at it too far, this also misses the mark. Why so? Because the cause of their protest is not that they have a crisis of meaning or they lack meaning and purpose. The cause of their protest, I would say, is that they have a different standard of meaning, a different standard of purpose than many of us who may be on the right have in our own lives. And that different standard of meaning and that different standard of purpose seems so alien to us because of how absurd it is. And frankly, I would argue that their standard of meaning and their standard of purpose is absurd, but that does not mean we should dismiss it as a result of feeling hopeless. We should instead understand that some people get their hope, get their vindication, and get their meaning from different places in life than other of us do. If we can embrace that very simple principle, which by the way is not really a political principle, it is a fundamentally human principle. In philosophical language, it is a teleological principle. If we can embrace that simple principle, then we should be able to understand what the standard of meaning for many youth activists actually happens to be. There are a few pillars of left-wing thought that I think kind of encompass the standard of meaning I'm talking about here. One of those pillars is the idea of the subjective personal truth as opposed to the external objective truth. You may have heard the term my truth, my lived experience, my reality. All of these terms are a part of that broader tradition of believing that truth is fundamentally a matter of perception and not a matter of concrete reality. This is a very core ethos of many left-wing youth activism, because you will oftentimes hear protesters and activists say you have to respect someone's lived experience no matter what. You have to respect someone's reality no matter what. And you will then see them take this idea of lived experience and subjective truth and build it into a worldview where you can understand the entirety of someone's person by way of what they have experienced in life and by way of what social institutions they have interacted with. So if someone is black, for example, in this worldview, and they happen to be disabled and they happen to be gay, all those three things would then be definitive about that particular person, and then you can take those three things and then apply them on a broader scale to guess what kind of challenges they may face. This is not to say that disabled folks or whatever don't face challenges. They certainly do. But when you take a challenge that someone's faced and you turn it into a matter of knowing them, what you're actually doing is you're ignoring the actual person and you're building a picture of a person in your mind, and you're using this picture of that person to forward a political end. And that picture may not line up with reality. We are more than our component parts. We are more than our struggles. But to this worldview, someone's lived experience is absolutely absolute. That's one of the ethos. Another ethos would be allyship. The idea that based on this notion, this sort of shoddy notion of lived experience, that you need to be allies with people who may have access to certain kinds of truths that you don't have access to by virtue of their lived experience. And then the third one I would say is this sense of egalitarian social justice. Now, this egalitarian social justice kind of gives this kind of righteousness and this alarmism that characterizes so many youth activist pushes. This righteousness and this alarmism gives people like Greta Thunberg, the famed spokesperson for every bad environmentalist idea ever conceived, or someone like David Hogg, the famous spokesperson for every anti-self-defense, anti-self-preservation, and ultimately anti-civilizational idea ever conceived by the anti-gun lobby. It gives both of them this ability to say, in terms of this alarmism, that if we don't do this right now, the people who oppose us are participating in murder, or they are participating in the destruction of our planet. I mean, the people that oftentimes support gun control, especially the young ones, will literally say, how many more of us have to die for you to act? Basically blaming the deaths of kids on people who want to defend themselves. And the ones who are the environmentalist alarmists literally say, how much pain must our planet go through for you to actually do something? This is not just rhetoric. This is not just idiotic stuff. This is not just empty words. These are literally a reflection of the egalitarian social justice ethos, which empowers these people within their standard of meaning, within their hierarchy of values, to act. Human action is not just significant because it does something. It is significant because there is always a principle motivating your action. The principle motivating my action to speak to you right now is the principle of wanting to find the truth and to educate. If I was motivated by deceit, my actions would take a different character than they're taking right now. And that's the point. If you don't understand the principle behind these actions, you won't understand the actions fundamentally, because they won't be connected to anything that is objective. They'll just be conjecture in your mind. So, with those three things in mind, we should understand that there is, from those things, a sense of meaning and purpose these left-wing activists get. Now, I think it's absurd for many reasons. As I mentioned before, I think that ultimately individuals and concrete people are more important than abstract ideas. I think that ultimately the ethics of emergency and alarmism are no way to do morality and honesty. You cannot think clearly when your thinking is couched in alarmist terms. You would be thinking in terms of what can I do in the short term as opposed to what can I do in the long term. And third, I think that social justice is a perversion of actual justice, and it gives you it's a kind of false moral authority that gives you no true ground to stand on. But I can address all of these things because I understand these things. The truth is, we have a conflict of values, a conflict of a hierarchy of values. Some people value other things more than other people. But it doesn't mean that one group lacks meaning and the other has meaning. Because there are many people on the right who've embraced total nihilism in the face of what we're facing. They call them the doomers, right? They exist. And so if we should just believe that the right or conservative values gives us all meaning, then why do so many doomers exist? It's not the values that give you meaning. The values are a prerequisite for meaning. It's how you approach those values in your everyday life. We should do our best as those who love America, as those who love civilization, and those who love the truth, to convince those who are away from the light of those values that there is a better path. And that better path doesn't include telling them that they're dumb, that they're useless, or that they're confused. It includes telling them with a reason and love the error of their ways so they can be led to a better life. That is going to be the approach to breaking down the contours of this revolutionary vanguard. Understanding what they believe, studying what they believe, then rejecting it and giving them an alternative so that they can thrive. My friends, if you like this video, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can. Let's get this channel successful. If you enjoy a political commentary with a philosophical tinge, you can also, of course, comment, subscribe, like, do whatever you can, share the video. If you want to donate to me, you can do that on Patreon, PayPal, wherever you want to donate. It's all in the comment section down below. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please, 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 stay pensive. Bye, guys.